60 Minutes, Rewind.
The gusher, unleashed in the Gulf of Mexico, continues to spew crude oil. There are no reliable estimates of how much oil is pouring into the Gulf, but it comes to many millions of gallons since the catastrophic blowout. 11 men were killed in the explosions that sank one of the most sophisticated drilling rigs in the world, the Deepwater Horizon. This week, Congress continues its investigation, but Congress has not heard from the man you are about to meet. Mike Williams was one of the last crew members to escape the inferno. He says the destruction of the Deepwater Horizon had been building for weeks in a series of mishaps. The night of the disaster, he was in his workshop when he heard the rig's engines suddenly run wild. That was the moment that explosive gas was shooting across the decks, being sucked into the engines that powered the rig's generators.
I hear the engines revving. The lights are glowing. I'm hearing the alarms. I mean, they're at a constant state now. It's just beep, 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 beep. It doesn't stop. But even that's starting to get drowned out by the sound of the engine increasing in speed. And my lights get so incredibly bright that they physically explode. I'm pushing my way back from the desk when my computer monitor exploded.
This is the Deepwater Horizon in the hours before its destruction, the night of April 20th. Ironically, the end was coming only months after the rig's greatest achievement. Mike Williams was the chief electronics technician in charge of the rig's computers and electrical systems, and 7 months before, he'd helped the crew drill the deepest oil well in history, 35,000 feet.
It was special. There's no way around it. Everyone was talking about it. The congratulations that were flowing around, it made you feel proud to work there.
Williams worked for the owner, Transocean, the largest offshore drilling company. Like its sister rigs, the Deepwater Horizon cost $350 million, rose 378 feet from bottom to top, both advanced and safe. None of her 126 crew had been seriously injured in 7 years. The safety record was remarkable because offshore drilling today pushes technology with challenges matched only by the space program. Deepwater Horizon was in 5,000 feet of water and would drill another 13,000 feet, a total of 3.5 miles. The oil and gas down there are under enormous pressure, and the key to keeping that pressure under control is this fluid that drillers call mud. Mud is a man-made drilling fluid that's pumped down the well and back up the sides in continuous circulation. The sheer weight of this fluid keeps the oil and gas down and the well under control.
Come on, come on!
The tension in every drilling operation is between doing things safely and doing them fast. Time is money, and this job was costing BP $1 million a day. But Williams says there was trouble from the start. Getting to the oil was taking too long.
How long did you expect it to take?
We were told 21 days.
How long did it actually take?
We were at 6 weeks.
With the schedule slipping, Williams says a BP manager ordered a faster pace.
And he requested to the driller, hey, let's bump it up, let's bump it up. And what he was talking about there is he's bumping up the rate of penetration, how fast the drill bit is going down.
Williams says going faster caused the bottom of the well to split open, swallowing tools and the drilling fluid called mud.
We actually got stuck. And we got stuck so bad that we had to send tools down into the drill pipe and sever the pipe.
That well was abandoned. Deepwater Horizon had to drill a new route to the oil. It cost BP more than 2 weeks and millions of dollars.
We were informed of this during one of the safety meetings that somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 million was lost in bottom hole assembly and mud. And you always kind of knew that in the back of your mind when they start throwing these big numbers around, that there was going to be a push coming, a push to pick up production, pick up the pace.
There was pressure on the crew after this happened?
There's always pressure, but yes, the pressure was increased.
But the trouble was just beginning. When drilling resumed, Williams says there was an accident on the rig that has not been reported before. He says 4 weeks before the explosion, the rig's most vital piece of safety equipment was damaged. Down near the seabed is the Blowout Preventer, or BOP. It's used to seal the well shut. In order to test the pressure and integrity of the well, and in case of a blowout, it's the crew's only hope. A key component is a rubber gasket at the top called an annular, which can close tightly around the drill pipe. Williams says that during a test they closed the gasket, but while it was shut tight, a crewman on deck accidentally nudged a joystick, applying hundreds of thousands of pounds of force and moving 15 feet of drill pipe through the closed blowout preventer. Later, a man monitoring drilling fluid rising to the top made a troubling find.
He discovered chunks of rubber in the drilling fluid. He thought it was important enough to gather this double handful of chunks of rubber and bring them into the driller shack. I recall asking the supervisor if this was out of the ordinary. He said, "Oh, it's no big deal." And I thought, how can it be not a big deal? There's chunks of our seal is now missing.
And Williams says he knew about another problem with the blowout preventer. The BOP is operated from the surface by wires connected to two control pods. One is a backup. Williams says that one of the pods lost some of its function weeks before. Transocean tells us the BOP was tested by remote control after these incidents and passed, but nearly a mile below there was no way to know how much damage there was or why the pod seemed unreliable. In the hours before the disaster, Deepwater Horizon's work was nearly done. All that was left was to seal the well closed. The oil would be pumped out by another rig later. Williams says that during a safety meeting, the manager for the rig owner, Transocean, was explaining how they were going to close the well when the manager from BP interrupted.
I had the BP company man sitting directly beside me, and he literally perked up and said, "Well, my process is different, and I think we're going to do it this way." And they kind of lined out the way he thought it should go that day. So there was sort of a chest bumping kind of deal. The communication seemed to really break down as to who was ultimately in charge.
The day of the accident, BP flew several managers to the Deepwater Horizon for a ceremony to congratulate the crew for 7 years without an injury. While they were there, a surge of explosive gas came flying up the well from 3 miles below. The rig's diesel engines, which power its electric generators, sucked in the gas and began to run wild.
I'm hearing hissing, the engines are over revving, and then all of a sudden all the lights in my shop just started getting brighter and brighter and brighter. And I knew then something bad was getting ready to happen.
It was almost 10 at night, and directly under the Deepwater Horizon were four men in a fishing boat.
Rushing sound, this hissing
Hendry,
sound,
Dustin
and then
King,
you moved
Ryan
off and you
Chasen,
started fishing.
And Wesley Borg.
When I heard the gas coming out, I knew exactly what it was almost immediately.
When the gas cloud was descending on you, what was that like?
It was scary. And when I looked at it, it burned my eyes, and I knew we had to get out of there.
You could tell what it was.
I knew it was methane.
On the rig, Mike Williams was reaching for a door to investigate the engine noise.
These are 3-inch thick steel fire-rated doors with 6 stainless steel hinges supporting them on the frame. As I reached for the handle, I heard this awful hissing noise, this whoosh, and at the height of the hiss, a huge explosion. The explosion literally rips the door from the hinges. Impacts me and takes me to the other side of the shop. And I'm up against the wall when I finally come around with a door on top of me. And I remember thinking to myself, this is it. I'm gonna die right here.
The men on the fishing boat had a camera.
Look at the water on fire.
I began to crawl across the floor. As I got to the next door, it exploded and took me, the door, and slid me about 35 feet backwards again and planted me up against another wall. At that point, I actually got angry. I was mad at the doors. I was mad that these fire doors that are supposed to protect me are hurting me. And at that point, I made a decision. I'm going to get outside. I may die out there, but I'm going to get outside. So I crawl across the gridwork of the floor and make my way to that opening where I see the light. I made it out the door, and I thought to myself, I've accomplished what I set out to accomplish. I made it outside. At least now I can breathe. I may die out here, but I can breathe.
Williams couldn't see. Something was pouring into his eyes, and that's when he noticed a gash on his forehead.
I didn't know if it was blood. I didn't know if it was brains. I didn't know if it was flesh. I didn't know what it was. I just knew I was in trouble. At that point, I grabbed a life jacket. I was on the aft lifeboat deck. There were 2 functioning lifeboats at my disposal right there. But I knew I couldn't board them. I had responsibilities.
His responsibility was to report to the bridge, the rig's command center.
I'm hearing alarms. I'm hearing radio chatter, mayday, mayday, mayday. We've lost propulsion. We've lost power. We have a fire. Man overboard on the starboard forward deck.
Multiple personnel on water. Any person able to send help will be really appreciated.
Williams says that on the bridge, he watched them try to activate emergency systems.
The BOP that was supposed to protect us and keep us from the blowout obviously had failed, and now the emergency disconnect to get us away from this fuel source has failed. We have no communications to the BOP.
Situation around and fire in the water, people jumping in the water, and shipping life rafts.
And I see one of the lifeboats in the water, and it's motoring away from the vessel. I looked at the captain and asked him, I said, what's going on? He said, I've given the order to abandon ship.
Every Sunday, they had practice lifeboat drills and the procedure for making sure that everyone was accounted for. But in the panic, all that went to hell. The lifeboats were leaving.
They're leaving without you?
They have left without the captain and without knowing that they had everyone that had survived all this on board. I've been left now by 2 lifeboats. And I look at the captain and I said, what do we do now? By now, the fire is not only on the derrick, it's starting to spread to the deck. At that point, there were several more explosions, large, intense explosions.
What do they feel like, sound like?
It just take your breath away type explosions, shake your body to the core explosions. Take your vision away from the percussion of the explosions.
About 8 survivors were left on the rig. They dropped an inflatable raft from a crane, but with only a few of the survivors on the raft, it was launched, leaving Williams, another man, and a crewwoman named Andrea.
I remember looking at Andrea and seeing that look in her eyes of she had quit, she had given up. I remember her saying, I'm scared. And I said, it's okay to be scared, I'm scared too. She said, what are we gonna do? I said, we're gonna burn up or we're gonna jump.
How far is it to the sea?
Maybe 90 feet, 100 feet. It's a long ways.
In the middle of the night, with blood in his eyes, fire at his back, and the sea 10 stories below, Williams made his choice.
I remember closing my eyes and saying a prayer and asking God to tell my wife, little girl, that Daddy did everything he could. And if I survive this, it's for a reason. I made those 3 steps, and I pushed off the end of the rig. And I fell for what seemed like forever. A lot of things go through your mind.
The story will continue after this.
With a life jacket, Mike Williams, the chief electronics technician aboard the Deepwater Horizon, jumped feet first off the deck and away from the inferno. He had witnessed key events before the disaster, but if he was going to tell anyone, he would have to survive a 10-story drop into the sea.
I went down way below the surface, obviously. And when I popped back up, I felt like, okay, I've made it. But I feel this god-awful burning all over me. And I'm thinking, am I on fire? You know, I just don't know. So I start doing the only thing I know to do, swim. I gotta get away from this thing. I could tell I was floating in oil and grease and diesel fuel. I mean, it was just the smell. And I remember looking under the rig and seeing the water on fire. And I thought, what have you done? You were dry and you weren't covered in oil up there. Now you've jumped and you've made this and you've landed in oil. The fire's gonna come across the water and you're gonna burn up. And I thought that you just gotta swim harder. So I swam and I kicked and I swam and I kicked and I swam as hard as I could until I remember not feeling any more pain. And I didn't hear anything. And I thought, well, I must have burned up because I don't feel anything, I don't hear anything, I don't smell anything. I must be dead. Then I remember a real faint voice of, over here, and I thought, what in the world is that? And the next thing I know, he grabbed my life jacket and flipped me over into this small open-bowed boat. I didn't know who he was, I didn't know where he'd come from, I didn't care. I was now out of the water.
William's survival may be critical to the investigation. We took his story to Dr. Bob B., a professor of engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. Last week, the White House asked B. to help analyze the Deepwater Horizon accident. B. investigated the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster for NASA and the Hurricane Katrina disaster for the National Science Foundation. B's voice never completely recovered from the weeks that he spent in the flood in New Orleans, but as the White House found, he's among the nation's best. He's investigated more than 20 offshore rig disasters.
Mr. Williams comes forward with these very detailed elements from his viewpoints on the rig. That's a brave and intelligent man.
What he's saying is very important to this investigation, you believe?
It is.
What strikes Professor B. is Mike Williams' description of the blowout preventer. Williams says that in a drilling accident 4 weeks before the explosion, the critical rubber gasket called an annular was damaged and pieces of it started coming out of the well.
According to Williams, when parts of the annular start coming up onto the deck, someone from Transocean says, look, don't worry about it. What does that tell you?
Houston, I think we have a problem.
Here's why that's so important. The annular is used to seal the well for pressure tests, and those tests determine whether dangerous gas is seeping in.
So if the annular is damaged, if I understand you correctly, you can't do the pressure tests in a reliable way.
That's correct. You may get pressure test recordings, but because you're leaking pressure, they're not reliable.
Mike Williams also told us that a backup control system to the blowout preventer called a pod had lost some of its functions.
What is the standard operating procedure if you lose one of the control pods on the BOP?
Reestablish it, fix it. It's like losing one of your legs.
The morning of the disaster, according to Williams, there was an argument in front of all of the men on the shift between the Transocean manager and the BP manager. Do you know what that argument was about?
Yes.
What was it?
Who's boss?
In finishing the well, the plan was to have a subcontractor, Halliburton, place 3 concrete plugs, like corks, in the column. The Transocean manager wanted to do this with the column full of heavy drilling fluid, what drillers call mud, to keep the pressure down below contained. But the BP manager wanted to begin to remove the mud before the last plug was set. That would reduce the pressure controlling the well before the plugs were finished.
Why would BP want to do that?
It expedites the subsequent steps.
It's a matter of going faster.
Faster, sure.
Who won the argument?
BP.
If the mud had been left in the column, would there have been a blowout?
It doesn't look like it.
To do it BP's way, they had to be absolutely certain that the first 2 plugs were keeping the pressure down. That life or death test was done using the blowout preventer, which had the damaged gasket. Investigators have also found that the BOP had a hydraulic leak and a weak battery.
Weeks before the disaster, they know that they are drilling into a very dangerous formation. The formation has told them that.
That's correct.
And has cost them millions of dollars.
That's correct.
And they know the BOP is broken.
Correct.
Broken in a number of ways.
Correct.
What is the appropriate thing to do at that point?
I express it to my students this way. It's stop, think, don't do something stupid.
They didn't stop. As the drilling fluid was removed, relieving the downward pressure, the plugs failed. The blowout preventer didn't work, and 11 men were incinerated. 115 crew members survived. 2 days later, the Deepwater Horizon sank to the bottom. This was just the latest disaster for a company that is the largest oil producer in the United States. BP, once known as British Petroleum, was found willfully negligent in a 2005 Texas refinery explosion that killed 15 of its workers. BP was hit with $108 million in fines, the highest workplace safety fines in U.S. history. Now, we have found there is new concern about another BP facility in the Gulf. A former BP insider tells us this platform, called Atlantis, is a greater threat than the Deepwater Horizon. Ken Abbott has worked for Shell and GE, and in 2008 he was hired by BP to manage thousands of engineering drawings for the Atlantis platform.
They serve as blueprints and also as a operator manual, if you will, on how to make this thing work and, more importantly, how to shut it down in an emergency.
But Abbott says that he found that 89% of those critical drawings had not been inspected and approved by BP engineers. Even worse, he says 95% of the underwater welding plans had never been approved either.
Are these welding procedures supposed to be approved in the paperwork before the welds are done?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So they're
critical.
Critical.
Abbott's charges are backed up by BP internal emails. In 2008, BP manager Barry Duff wrote that the lack of approved drawings could result in catastrophic operator errors. And currently, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of subsea documents that have never been finalized. Duff called the practice fundamentally wrong.
I've never seen this kind of attitude where, safety doesn't seem to matter, and when you complain of a problem like Barry did and like I did and try to fix it, you're just criticized and pushed aside.
Ken Abbott was laid off. He took his concerns to a consumer advocacy group called Food and Water Watch. They're asking Congress to investigate, and he is filing suit in an attempt to force the federal government to shut down Atlantis.
The Atlantis is still pumping away out there, 200,000 barrels a day, and it'll be 4 times that in a year or two when they put in all 16 wells. I mean, if something happens there, it'll make the Deepwater Horizon look like a bubble in the water by comparison.
In an email, BP told us the Atlantis crew had all the documents it needs to run the platform safely. We also wanted BP's perspective on the Deepwater Horizon disaster. The company scheduled an interview with its CEO, Tony Hayward, and then they canceled, saying no one at BP could sit down with 60 Minutes for this report. In other interviews, Hayward has said this about Transocean, the owner of the Deepwater Horizon.
The responsibility for safety on the drilling rig is with Transocean. It is their rig, their equipment, their people, their systems, their safety processes.
When BP's Chief Executive Officer, Tony Hayward, says that this is Transocean's accident, what do you say?
I get sick. This kind of division in the industry is a killer. The industry is comprised of many organizations, and they all share the responsibility for successful operations. And to start placing, we'll call it these barriers, and pointing fingers at each other is totally destructive.
But who's responsible?
BP.
We went out on the Gulf and found mats of thick floating oil. No one has a fix on how much oil is shooting out of the well, but some of the best estimates suggest it's the equivalent of the Exxon Valdez spill every 4 to 7 days. Scientists are now reporting vast plumes of oil up to 10 miles long under the surface. The spill has cost BP about $500 million so far, but consider, in just the first 3 months of this year, BP made profits of $6 billion. There are plenty of accusations to go around that BP pressed for speed, Halliburton's cement plugs failed, and Transocean damaged the blowout preventer. Through all the red flags, they pressed ahead. It was, after all, the Deepwater Horizon, the world record holder, celebrated as among the safest in the fleet.
Men lost their lives. I don't know how else to say it. All the things that they told us could never happen, happened.